Hi, and welcome to another episode of On the Couch, where we collaborate with experts, practitioners, authors, advocates, and influencers to explore current social themes, sex-positive topics, and share stories and insights that matter.
This podcast was recorded on Aboriginal country. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that were never ceded, on which we live, work, and record upon.
We pay our respect to elders past and present, and to those who may be visiting our website or listening to our podcast today.
While listening, we encourage you to practice good self-care. And of course, check the show notes for further information.
Wherever you are, whatever you're doing,
enjoy this episode of On the Couch. I'm Winnie, and I'm joined by Lauren French today, and we are going to be yarning about Indigenous knowledge and approaches that are transforming sex education by centering inclusive, pleasure, and culturally safe ways of supporting well-being and preventing harm. So it's such a pleasure to welcome you on the couch, Lauren.
Thanks, Winnie. Thanks so much for having me. I also like that I'm wearing the same glasses as the photo that I really sent in. So I feel there's a bit of a continuity there of image, which is probably good.
I love that. As you know, Lauren, we really like using the concepts, fields of existence and coordinates of belonging by co-culture communications to introduce our guests. And these concepts really demonstrate that our beings are a field of activity made up of the stories we've been told, our ancestors that have existed, the land under our feet, and the places that we stand, and how these all enforce who we are in this moment as contextual beings. So, Lauren, how do you define and locate yourself, and what are your coordinates of belonging?
Thanks, Winnie. I really love that this is how you start, because I think it's so much the practice of First Nations people of meeting and connecting across many different avenues and planes. So for me, I must locate myself first in my upbringing and where I grew up. So I grew up on Larrakia country up north in Darwin in the warmth and sun, which is very much not where I currently am because it is very cold where I'm currently sitting. But in growing up, I got to grow up in sweaty, humid, tropical landscapes of Darwin. I grew up and lived in the same house that my mum and all of my aunts and uncles grew up in. So my mum is the fourth child of seven in an incredibly large, amazing Chinese Aboriginal family. So my mum, Rebecca Lee, and my father, Ken French, and I'm the eldest daughter for them. So what I find particularly important from that note is I got to grow up in an intergenerational household. So I grew up, as I said, in the same household my mum got to grow up in the same house. I actually was in the same room as her for quite a while. And so in that house, it was me, my sister, my mum, my dad, and my poppy. So my mum's father. This is Eric Lee. And he was, again, sort of had this huge, amazing family, around him. The house that unfortunately no longer stands, but was a house that went through Cyclone Tracy, which is something that my family went through in the home that I then grew up in. So when my mum and her siblings grew up in that home, it was a 2-story household. When I grew up in it, it was a 1-story household as the cyclone removed the top story. But I got to grow up in a space where our home was our home, but it was the meeting place of our family. Because it was our ancestral house, it meant that it was everyone's home and it was Poppy's home first. And so that meant I had cousins, aunties, uncles, everyone always dropping into our space. So our space was a meeting place. I made many cups of tea for many a conversation that was had in the kitchen. And to paint a picture, the kitchen was an incredible fluorescent lime green of another era completely, with everything was wood, so brown woods, and then the most fluorescent green, like all the cabinets, like everything. And then one of the most incredibly unique, I will say, tile feature near the kind of sink area. But to me, that's home. That's where I grew up in. And so the other kind of piece of that, how we came to Darwin. So I'm a Karajarri woman, and so my nana, so my poppy's mother, was born at Anna Plains Station, which is in Western Australia. But she was removed from family. She was taken at 5 years old and taken to Beagle Bay Mission, and was part of some of the earliest moments in our history of stolen generation removal. Her brother was taken to another mission in space, and through her work kind of growing up in the mission and then growing up as kind of a household servant, made her way to Darwin, ended up kind of actually coming into a very large Larrakia and Aboriginal family in Darwin. And so we've got a lot of ties and connections in those spaces, as well as for our, the Chinese part of our heritage. Our family also then comes from a very large Chinese family in Darwin, and one of the oldest Chinese families. And actually, if anyone's ever in Darwin and you go to the Chunghwa Society, they have a museum there, and they have scrolls of all of the quote unquote original kind of Chinese families that went to Darwin. And you can find my name if you go and look at. You have to find the largest scroll there, because our family is the largest descendant family, which is a point of pride and mild bragging. But you will be able to find me on that scroll. And so but for both sides of that family, when I think of locating myself, I grew up in a family of warmth, of incredible, staunch and strong matriarchs and women. So my mum's one of 7, as I said. There is only one boy in that family. And I grew up sort of surrounded by the most incredibly powerful, loud and proud women that I'm very proud to have descended from. I moved to Melbourne, and that's where I'm currently locating myself. So I live in Naarm. I've been here for 10 years, over just about 10 years now. And a kind of common part of a lot of young people who grow up north is to move for university, to move for knowledge. There is, I would say, both truth and some assumption in the limitations of staying up north for learning and opportunity. But many of us move. We also decide we want to experience this winter that we kept hearing about, this cold. Don't know if it's all that was cracked up to be or what it was told of me. I like wearing a coat and a scarf every now and then, but can be a bit much. Which is also very funny, because I feel once I moved to Naarm was actually some of the first times that I was able to really strengthen my identity as a First Nations woman, as my connections with mob, because it was the first time I was making really strong community connections outside of my family, or outside of the idea of family. And also Darwin, is a particularly large place, and so you're kind of very much known, and your family is very much known. Versus when I moved to Naarm, I kind of was creating further circles of culture and connectedness off country, in a way, while still having huge amounts of yearning for country. And I think that's how I also ended up doing work that was for community and with community, because I am constantly pulled with a need to contribute, as many of us are. And so in doing that, that's kind of how I've found spaces to contribute, and found spaces where, I think for some people, when you're off country, you almost spend more time trying to have connection, because the connection isn't necessarily as simple as below your feet or just looking out the window. There's almost, you look out into those spaces, and while country and nature here can be incredibly grounding and supporting, it creates yearning, because my country looks different. I don't get red dirt here the way that I do when I'm home. And so there's a pull that you always feel. So even though I'm creating an incredible life in Naarm, the pull never is removed. It's always still there, and it gets tighter at times. And when I go home and I come back, it loosens the string a little bit, and it gives me a bit more time until I'm kind of, pulled back, or that feeling of being pulled back. So yeah, that's probably I think my 2 big locations that I think are really important.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing those yearnings. It's, I think it really sets the tone for our conversation today, because it's so entrenched in your work, really, and that history and understanding of your culture and connection, I can see is really strength in your work. And I love the stories of those really strong, bold women because I can see that is something that leads you. Yeah. When we first met, we met at the World Association of Sexual Health Congress, or WAS for short, when Maddie and I attended in June 2025, so a whole year ago. And we were just in awe of you and incredibly inspired by your work and words. And I love that you mentioned your lime green kitchen, because in your keynote presentation on the Churchill Fellowship, you took us to that lime green kitchen right at the beginning of your presentation, and where you grew up, and us in the audience really felt that sense of community, and you really painted such a beautiful place of what that looked like for you. And that just speaks so deeply to your work, and that centres community, culture, and strengthens those intergenerational learnings and healings. And so, Lauren, you are a sexologist with a bachelor's in psychology. And we're really interested in what led you through your career path you've taken. And for our listeners, Lauren used to be the previous head of education and community development with Body Safety Australia, so a non-for-profit organisation specialising in child sexual abuse prevention, LGBTQIA plus equity and inclusivity, consent and respectful relationships education. And more recently, Lauren, you've stepped back into clinical practice as a clinical sexologist and sex therapist at SHIPS Psychology, which is really exciting. And can you tell us a bit about what led you to this change?
Yeah, of course. And I think this field and sector is so incredibly broad, and so often people can end up in similar spaces, similar roles, and our path has been completely different. We're all kind of finding different jigsaw pieces to the career and the spaces that we're developing. I might do like two things. So I'll talk about where I am now, but to kind of take a small step back, as I was studying my Masters of Sexology when I started volunteering for Body Safety Australia. So that was 8 years ago. And so I was with the organisation for 8 years. And through that time, I started as a volunteer. There were 4 of us in the entire organisation at the time that I started. And then I came on board as an educator. And by the time I left at the beginning of the year, when I was the head of education and community development, we had a team of almost 30. And in that 8 years, the amount of growth and opportunity that we were able to sit with was really incredible. But it was a space where I'd been for almost the entirety of my 20s. And I had been able to have incredible opportunity to do work with community. And I managed a large team of educators there. And throughout that work, I think also one of the reasons that I was able to stay for so long and continue to develop my practice with the organisation and the amount of education and teaching I was doing across schools across Australia was also because I was able to have other opportunities that fed other pieces of work that was really satisfying. So like I did work with like youth social change work, like specific like First Nations youth social change work. I did clinical practice while there, and I did a Churchill fellowship. And so I was able to kind of have these moments of coming in and out of what can sometimes be quite set work. And when I kind of got to, the position I was in, it was absolutely incredible. And also what I realized was I both created a bit of a ceiling within the org. I'd been there for so long, and there was space for opportunities to come for others. And also I realized I was really ready to be a learner again and really kind of develop skills and just like branch out into some other spaces with all of the knowledge that I developed over 8 years. And I think anyone that's in maybe a position of management or team leading or those sort of things, there's so much satisfaction and joy in supporting and creating opportunities for others. And also it can be really exciting and to kind of step into a space to look at that for yourself. And so, that's the choice that I've now made. And part of that is going back to do more clinical practice because it's a part of work that I really love. I think I've spent quite a number of the past couple of years really focusing on impact at quite a like a large scale, working with like whole schools, whole classrooms, whole communities. And I think post my Churchill fellowship, I wanted to come back to some individual work and work that's really kind of centers healing. And for me, that's really something that I want to do through clinical work. So hence why I've gone back to that clinical practice, and SHIPS is an incredible space, and they've welcomed me really warmly into be able to do that.
I love that. I love the recognition of just continuing learning. I think it's so important that we keep doing that in our careers, right? Like we can get in places where it just feels a bit like, okay, where am I? So I really love it. It can feel like a huge, big leap, hey, but it's really cool to see and definitely embrace and trust that the world and the people around you have got you, right?
Well, yeah, and I think, for myself, whether it's, if we talk about having like knowings or being led by ancestors or family or just just the beings of the world, I think, where I'm listening to the seasons of my own life and realize that, I think it's really powerful when you realize you're coming to the end of a season, and then quite exciting when you realize you're transitioning into a new season. And I think for me, I'm in that period of transition into a new season, which is really exciting. Terrifying in some ways, but really exciting.
I love that. The seasons of my life. I'm going to keep that in the back of my brain for something.
I think some people get really like attached to age with the seasons, as if, and even though I said like, most of my 20s and this sort of thing. I don't think it's age dependent. I think it is just that once you feel, a season is shifting and changing, and that can be really short. Like I remember when I moved to first year of uni, and then I went home to Darwin for like a couple of months in between like first and second year, as per like most uni students. And and it was only in that few months that I feel I had a really big season of life change. And so that was like a really short time period versus maybe now looking at, wow, I had like an 8-year season probably, and now I'm going into a completely different season.
Cool. I love how you work across prevention and education and clinical practice, and you speak a lot about respectful relationships and sex education, which I will refer to as RSE for short as I move forward. And that RSE that really centres pleasure and removes shame and stigma to empower young people to make their own informed decisions about their health, relationships and experiences. And that's an approach I really resonate with. And here on the couch and more broadly, the work we do at Caddy Shack, we talk a lot about shame, stigma and discrimination and how these really impact the communities that we work with. We've also had guests on the couch explore comprehensive RSE like Professor Jennifer Power, Dr. Giselle Woodley, Dr. Sarah Vrekovich, Tom and Adie from the Sticky Cues podcast, Katrina Marson, Dr. Melissa Kang and Yumi Steins. And for our listeners, jump on our website because you can find all of those recordings of those podcast episodes there. But shame and stigma and discrimination do create significant barriers for people to access sexual health services as well as quality RSE. And those of us working in this space are constantly challenging and trying to break down those barriers. So with that in mind, what does an inclusive, shame-free and pleasure-focused approach to RSE involve? And why is it so important for preventing STIs, unplanned pregnancies and sexual violence?
Thank you for putting me in with like the list of all of those incredible people. And yes, if people haven't listened to them, you 100% should. They're amazing. I think within this, the first thing I always want us to help shift our lens, and not to judge the question, but more because I think this is the way this question is worded to me often. And I think a lot of people in the sector will kind of come from this angle of how do we do inclusive, shame-free, pleasure-focused approaches, but for the cause of preventing STIs, unplanned pregnancy, sexual violence. And does really comprehensive RSE do all of those things? Yes, it does. But I always like to ground us in like the World Health definition of sexual health, and the fact that we cannot just look at this from a disease focused lens and from a, like if we're thinking about sexual health is not just the absence of disease. And that is a really deficit lens that we tend to look through in this sector. I also understand it. It's much easier and a bit more palatable for people if you're thinking about saying, well, I work in sexual health, and then you go, BBVs, STIs, pregnancy, and people go, oh, yep. Like, that's much more palatable versus going, yeah, I work in sexual health, pleasure. Pleasure is the capital P word that makes people quite uncomfortable. But it's critical that we shift that deficit framing because we cannot do this inclusive work if the only reason it's being done is because we just don't want people, to be unwell. Obviously, we don't want that, but sexual health is so much larger and all-encompassing. And I think sometimes the box that we actually get ourselves stuck in is just aiming for the lack of disease. Because then often when I work with young people and, older people, and we go, okay, well, I don't have disease, but like, what else? What else does actually sexual health look like? We want young people, we want everyone to know that there is experiences of joy. We want people to have incredible relationships, not just relationships that don't have violence. It's like we don't want the bar on the floor. We actually want to be thinking about what are we aiming for and moving towards. And so, we want to, when we're doing education, it's about going, how do we aim higher from that? Whenever I teach, I really want to make sure that everyone in that room feels seen and represented in what I'm talking about. And I think when we think about inclusive practice, when you do inclusive practice really well, you're actually just inviting everyone in. And instead of kind of shutting doors or creating frameworks that people have to fit themselves into that don't quite fit, like a too small jumper, we're actually just opening a door and going, actually, we're inviting everyone in. We're just creating more and more opportunities of inviting in, rather than having to go, well, your experience is X, so you have to be in the X box, and yours is Y, and you have to be in the Y box. Like, actually, how do we invite in and make it easier to step through the doors? We have so much shame wrapped around sexuality and sexual health and just being sexual beings. And at the same time, I always like to flip that, because while, yes, we have so much stigma around sex for our amazing asexual folk, there is also incredible shame and stigma around not fitting into sexual models. And so it's a bit of like damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of a space. And so, it doesn't create any real winners. And so if we think about removing shame for all people and all experiences of sex and sexuality as a human need, we create more space for curiosity. And to me, the key of inclusive, shame-free, pleasure-focused RSE is curiosity, because that's how we better connect with people. We learn what they truly want to know about and what they care about, not just what they've been told to care about. And when you speak to young people all the time, they've been told to care about STIs and unplanned pregnancies, and they've been told to care about all these, what often gets put as like the monster scary things that are going to ruin your life. And that's like what young people have told me, that that's the language. Versus there's not a lot of space of going, hey, where's like pleasure? How does pleasure, what does that even look like for our relationships, for our world, And so reclaiming our right to pleasure, and, both sexual and non-sexual pleasure actually really helps us move away from like Western moralistic, very oppressive ideas that kind of really infiltrate sexual health a lot of the time. And so also help us like start to decolonize our sphere, because, when we say we want to value and prioritize pleasure, it's quite radical. Shouldn't be, but it does tend to be.
I love that. Like, pleasure is how we'll decolonize our worlds. I think teaching from that pleasure-centered approach is so valuable. Like, it really brings young people into the conversation more like openly, because why do we have sex? Because it feels good. Like, it's kind of the most simple thing when you really think about it, but there's just so much of external pressure and views that really bring so much complexity to it. So I really love that. And I love you sharing the World Health Organization definition of sexual health. Because as sexual health promotion officers, we talk a lot about that and how our approach to sexual health is so much more than just preventing STIs or unplanned pregnancies. It's really all about relationships, pleasure, identity, connection, well-being, and feeling really empowered to make those choices for ourselves in our own lives. Our health and well-being are really influenced by so many interconnected parts of who we are, and we can't really separate those things from one another. And in your work, you talk a lot about seeing a person as a whole, not just through that lens of a particular issue. So in your work, how do you center the whole person?
Yeah, for some people, this might seem like the most obvious thing in the world, but we tend to segment people, and we tend to like to go, oh, I'm talking to this person about one particular thing. Maybe it is STIs. And so we've segmented their being and their history and where they're coming in and having this like meeting with us into this like one little piece. And so I think we need to be really clear that any time when we're meeting people, they are bringing their whole selves into the space, and so are we. Even though we might be wearing a professional hat, a work hat, whatever that is, you're still bringing your entire self, your history, your, if we think about your coordinates of being, you're bringing all of those coordinates in, and that person you're talking to is as well. But in our, Western spaces, often we're taught to just show a piece of it. Oh, okay, this is professional hat, so you get professional little segment, and the person's coming in going, well, this is health, so this is going to be my little health segment, and going, okay, well, actually there's so much more to us. And so I always think about, how do I create a safe space and build trust and relationships with people, even in short periods of time, so that I'm able to see more elements of their whole being, that they feel safe to actually express more elements of their whole being. And sometimes that needs to be modeled. So sometimes that's in doing, I am sharing more, and, within, as much as we say this, like still within professional boundaries and, ways that aren't putting pressure on the person, but just like giving a permission of, yes, I am this sexologist and this is my role. And also I'm a human and I have interconnected facets, and so do you. And you are here for a particular reason, but I'm seeing you as a person. And this might be like historical things that we value with our family and ourselves. It might be environmental things, but it's often coming back to a value of importance. And I'm very aware in like educational spaces, and when I was doing a lot of education in schools, it's like you have 45 minutes or you have like 1 hour to do 100 things, and it's the curriculum, and it's like this kind of little tiny scope, and success looks really particular. But I think we also need to be really clear that when we're giving information to young people, to anyone, we're giving them information often that they only want like a tiny bit of right now, but they're probably going to need the rest of it later. And so we have to think about, okay, well, the more I'm seeing this whole person, the more I'm able to understand their timeline of information and follow their curiosity. And I think it also alleviates some of the pressure of, oh, I have to give all of this information to you right now because this is the only opportunity and chance, rather than following the curiosity that person has, that you have, and what's needed in the moment.
Yeah, I love that. Makes me think as well, like there's a bigger impact than just on those young people. Like how does centering that whole person impact then the families and educators and that whole community?
Yeah, well, I think it impacts the family and the educators because, firstly, of how it impacts the young people, because it creates more spaces to give permission to share openly. And so when young people are sharing openly, it gives all of the adults around them insight. And I think, so often in the work that I've done over the years, like the question we always keep coming back to is like, what are young people thinking about and doing, and what's their reasoning? And we're trying to solve for problems without having honest conversations with young people around what the problem is or how it looks. And so when you're able to have more open curiosity and sharing of young people, it tells all of the adults what's important. It helps tell the adults what's not important. It helps show the adults where the gaps are. But I also think it really allows more freedom for the families, for the educators, in how we meet young people's needs. Because I think we can get very restrictive in, as I said, like those success models, or to have I hit these points of the curriculum. Not to bag out curriculum. Curriculum is really important and can do really great things. But I think when we're feeding that curiosity, that is critical to actually really creating like lifelong conversations with young people and open communication about RSE, because RSE is a lifelong learning and a lifelong experience. And I think when it's really restrictive to, well, you're 16, and so at 16, this is what we're telling you need to know. And rather going, okay, you're at this moment in your world, and here's all the pieces that are you as a whole person. So like, what do you need? What's the curiosity? And yes, we can hit these things, but like, what's going to actually be the most impactful to you in this moment?
I love that. Curiosity is so important, and so important for us as adults and us as parents, as teachers. Like you said, it's a lifelong journey. Like I work in this space and still learning, because there's so much to learn, and you go through those different seasons of your life. And so you will take on different things, and you'll kind of understand things in a different context. And learning and having that education is just so crucial to be able to really take on those experiences, I think.
Yeah. And I think as well, but for parents particularly, but for adults, like that curiosity, I think you have to have back to a young person. I think when a young person does have questions or a curiosity about a topic, we can sometimes jump to worst case. Why are you asking me this? You're asking me this because X, Y, Z. And often those are kind of in an extreme space without kind of spending time being curious, actually asking why they're asking it. Oh, that's really interesting. Why are we thinking about that now? Because again, what's happening in their world to make them think of this?
Yeah. Whereas we often jump to that worst case scenario sometimes, and there's good reasons for that, I guess, in some certain spaces. But yeah, it's a good point to kind of remind ourselves of that. I do want to shift our conversation a bit now into more your research and learnings through your Churchill Fellowship in 2023, where you focused on Indigenous elder-guided relationship and community repair after youth sexual violence. And I'm going to take us back to the WAS conference, because your keynote presentation about woven knowledge and the findings from your fellowship was really memorable. And honestly, the start of thinking about this episode, Maddie and I looked at each other and thought, what a great guest and what a great message to really share on the couch to our audiences. And what was really powerful was the strength-based narrative of centering Indigenous knowledge, cultural strengths, relationships, and community wisdom as those critical foundations of healing. And we often hear about conversations responding to sexual violence framed through those Western models of healing, focusing more on those individual aspects, individual therapy, those justice systems. But your work really invites us to think differently about what becomes possible when we centre those Indigenous ways of knowing, being and doing, and that wisdom. So those strengths, I guess, in community. And can you take us on a journey of what it means when we move away from Western models of healing and centre the knowledge and strengths held within First Nations and Indigenous communities?
Yeah, and thank you for your kind words about my keynote. I never know where a keynote lands, so it's always good. As you said, Western spaces, specifically for healing, are individualistic and transactional. And they don't always, like those two things are not always connected. Like when I think about the work I'm currently doing as a sexologist and somebody who practices sexology in quite often Western spaces, it can be quite individualistic. That doesn't mean it must be transactional, but that tends to be the model in which Western healing spaces are built off of. The foundations are transactional. In my Churchill Fellowship, for those who are unfamiliar, Churchill Fellowship is a funded international research fellowship where you learn globally to come back and ideally inspire locally, which sounds like I'm doing slightly, which is great. And over 9 weeks, I travelled to Aotearoa, New Zealand, Turtle Island, both Canada and the United States, as well as Sampi in Norway, and went to the Sami Parliament there. And so I was meeting Indigenous people globally and looking at our shared ways of, ancestral healing practices, as well as our shared experiences of colonization and the removal of our healing practices. And so I kind of, within my fellowship and travels, was able to meet absolutely incredible both young people and elders, and looking at how intergenerational knowledge is shared. And obviously a crucial element of colonization has been the intentional severing of intergenerational relationships through both a removal of language from oral storytellers and, communities that pass knowledge through language. And so having those severed ties has led to so much lost knowledge and lost practices. However, that doesn't mean everything is lost, and there is so much of shared understanding of healing globally. And when I went and did my research fellowship, I was doing Indigenous ways of research, and very much centered on yarning and allowing ancestral, for some, if you're sitting in really Western spaces, this can sometimes be not even confronting, but just a confusing mind shift. So I ask if that's you, just to sit with it and allow it to have truth and not question all your other truths in your world. But for Indigenous researching practices, we're going and creating safe yarning spaces to invite our ancestors in, to guide us where knowledge needs to be guided to. And so that means that when you go into that sort of research, it's very open. And if you were within a kind of Western, university institution, they would be like, this is not going to do it. And yet across my 9 weeks, and different continents and countries and cities and spaces, the ancestral pool led us to exactly the conversations we need to have, and the same conversations across those spaces, even though I wasn't coming with the same questions. We just ended up being pulled in the same directions. There was a continued knowing that we followed. Which, again, sit with it if you need it. It can be quite counter to how we think about research. But when I kind of come back to that Western space, that transactional idea, it operates healing outside of community, and as if healing is only about a single person. And it doesn't it doesn't acknowledge harm impacting across community. And so when we recognize First Nation ways of being and doing, we need to understand the relational groundwork. And so the fact that there is an interconnectedness from both ourselves and country, but ourselves and our community and as people. And so it isn't about an individual. An individual has been harmed, but that harm has harmed the community. It's harmed the person that did the harming. That person who is harmed has also been harmed in that process. And I think this can be hard for, non-Indigenous people to always understand, because the view of community is quite small and narrow. It's my immediate family, it's who lives in my house, or it's, it's quite small. Tangent, I'm not going to go through the tangent, I just want to acknowledge that it's over there. But I find it so fascinating in Western spaces, the kind of gap that has been created with the generational movements away from organized religion, and the gap that this has created in shared community and shared values and shared moralistic direction. I have lots of feelings about religion, which I'm not going to go into, but I find it really interesting, the gap that it's created. And so the view continues to be individualistic. We live in such close quarters with so many people, and yet we would not consider the people closest to you physically your community. And so sometimes we find that community in school, in sport, in groups, and in other spaces. But from a healing and harm perspective, that community doesn't come in to that lens. And so the community is really narrow. And so without it, it creates this kind of vacuum that kind of gets filled up with other elements. And when we think of Western spaces, that vacuum is kind of then created, the justice system that it sits in now, which is all about shunning those that harm and isolating from community.
Mm.
And this need to prove innocence and guilt becomes crucial to justice. I'm using quotation marks for anyone not watching this. But in doing that, and in all my research and conversations globally, this need to put innocence and guilt is not helpful for healing. It's not actually a part of healing. What it actually does, that framing, makes it so hard for the person who is harmed to acknowledge the impact, because there's too much emphasis on trying to prevent the isolation of community, because the isolation of community is actually not helpful for that person to heal or the community to heal. It often also means the community must split. And when particularly sexual violence, like I spent 8 years working within sexual violence with young people, and most of the time that is perpetrated by people within the community, it's close people, those people share community. And so once violence and harm has occurred, community severs, and community goes, okay, we will support the person that has been harmed. And then this other group goes, okay, we will support the person that is harmed. And the two can never now meet. The community is fractured, and they are helping these two arms. There's a beautiful kind of analogy when I was in Alaska and working with some incredible Native women there that do work in sexual violence. And they were talking about, the analogy was an eagle, which is, one wing, an arm of our work is to support people that have experienced harm, to come back into themselves and to have a time of transition out of who they have now become after being harmed. And then another wing of that eagle is supporting the people who have harmed. And supporting the people who have harmed does not mean that we accept the harm. It's actually the complete opposite. It's that we've acknowledged that they have actually stepped outside of themselves, outside of our community. And so there is acknowledgement and healing and accountability work that must be done. And that cannot be done if they are removed from the community. Doesn't mean they have to be with the person that they've harmed. It's not like everyone has to stay in a room until everyone's healed. But it's not that they're not leaving the community. The community has to actually support that person. These are the two wings, but an eagle does not fly if it does not have a body. And the body is the community. The community is what wraps around those two arms. If the community is severed, the bird doesn't fly. The healing can't happen. Community is the integral piece to healing that we have lost in Western spaces. This rupture has created this kind of, again, as I said, chasm and gap that gets filled by like legal systems and prisons and again, quote unquote, ideas of justice. But the community isn't wrapped around those two spaces. And so it creates isolation. And so, when I've spoken to young people who have experienced sexual violence, very few of them have ever said they want that person to go to jail. That's not the ask. That's not the want. That doesn't feel like it supports their healing. What they want is for acknowledgement of the impact of the actions of the person who harmed. They want that person to never do it again. That's the big piece. They want them to never do it again. Now, if that's where we want to get to, how can you get there if you can't allow the person to acknowledge that they've harmed? And we can't let that person acknowledge it if they are so terrified that they're going to be isolated from their community. And that there is going to be that rupture, At the same time, you've got community that then will not let someone acknowledge that they've hurt people or harmed because they do not want to lose that community member. And so everything becomes so fractured. Now, before someone like takes this and quotes it and they end up on the news, I'm not saying no one should ever go to prison. And the justice system is not necessarily my quote unquote expertise. Chat to Katrina Marsden if you want to listen to her, probably around way more about that. But healing doesn't magically happen when someone goes to jail. Court processes often add harm. They do not alleviate harm. And this does not create ground for healing work. And, the communities where harm has occurred, communities need healing. So the whole Western idea of individual harm needs to be completely shifted and removed out. And I'm sure some people kind of can name this as when they think about if you've had an experience with restorative justice, and I have. And I think there's lots within that, but I also think even even within restorative justice practices, there's something in that word justice that just, I think, sometimes limits our ideas of healing and timeline of healing and scope of healing, and the fact that that community piece needs to be centered.
That I am going to have to go back and listen to that multiple times, because that was so incredibly powerful, and I have so many thoughts jumping around in my brain, and I think it actually makes me, I'm trying to kind of connect to how I feel hearing it all, because it does make me feel like, I feel like I kind of am almost mourning something that I really wish we had so much more of, because I could just see so much more healing, so much better, stronger communities if we were able to really connect in that way to support those people who have harmed or who have experienced harm. And I really think it's so important to also focus and acknowledge that it is someone who has perpetrated harm who also needs support, and because they have been let down by a system as well, you know, and that's how we can really, when we're talking about strength-based approaches, I think that's how we can really reach and actually create these education and prevention initiatives that are going to strengthen and move us away from how much violence or sexual violence is in our communities. So I really love that acknowledgement and the strength of community when it comes to that. And as you said at the end there, talking about the language, like the term justice, you know, I think there's also a lot of there's so much language we use in this space that unintentionally define young people by what's happened to them, rather than what they're recognised for their strengths, resilience and agency. And taking that strength-based approach and shifting the focus from asking what's wrong with someone to instead asking what can we do to support that person. And I think that's really important when we're talking about people who've experienced harm also entering services and systems. Because as healthcare professionals, teachers, social workers, we are often in positions where our responses and our approaches can either reinforce those deficit narratives or create opportunities for healing, empowerment, and connection. So what does it look like in practice for young people impacted by sexual violence when we move away from those deficit lenses, and how can this change services and systems?
Yeah, I think, well, obviously, you know, the research I did in that and the work that I've predominantly done is with young people. And so, as you said, you know, the young person who has harmed themselves in doing that action, and the community, there is a gap there. This person has gotten to a space where harm is the movement, whether that's from a lack of education, a lack of moralistic support, whether it's from a lack of, you know, people around them, or even just open conversation around RSE. And, you know, we think there's so much more emphasis on conversations around consent, particularly compared to when I was a young person in school. And yet when I also still have conversations with young people, they go, okay, now we really get consent, but like, okay, but now that also makes me think, yep, so I've gotten a yes, but now what? And so we have like consensual maybe experiences that still aren't the aim or where we're looking for with young people, which I think is an important piece to ground ourselves in as well. You know, consent's a fundamental. It's not the end. It's not the whole piece. It's a fundamental practice actually that everyone needs knowledge for. So when we think about that, you know, for young people particularly impacted by sexual violence, deficit lens for young people, you know, if we have a deficit lens around with sexual violence, the young person who is harmed, that's it. That's their label, that's their world. They either acknowledge harm and get separated from their community, or they never acknowledge harm and never learn and never shift, and their being will shift because they are never able to heal from the harm that they are causing and that they have caused themselves and their community. The person that is harmed ends up in a space of going, well, either I must go through harmful justice proceedings, court proceedings, police proceedings, or this can only be a piece of me that cannot be shared. And this ends up in this kind of, again, deficit view of false accusations and he said, she said, and this kind of language of shame and stigma. And I think also this idea as well of, what the impact of that harm looks like. So when we think about strength-based, it's about going, okay, harm has occurred. This has created a transition or like a transformation for this person. What transformation do we want to aim for that we're kind of trying to move to? Because I think this idea of we're trying to come back or, go back to pre-harm, anyone that works in healing space will tell you it's not about that. It's about going, okay, where are we transforming to next? What do we need? And what strengths do we already hold? And, really acknowledging the strengths this young person already has. And then also connecting to the community. What are the strengths the community has? And how do we build those up? In the same way that the person is harmed, what are their strengths in community and how are we utilizing that and connecting that back in? And I think so often, again, our systems and services are individual. They don't include community around those people. They don't include community accountability and ideas of, I think that's also why I keep coming back to this word justice. Justice, towards who? Because from what I hear from people, who have experienced harm, that's not justice for them. And it's not justice for the community that has experienced the fracture and harm. So, okay, how do we link back into that idea? And again, having that knowledge of strength that community can, when given opportunity and support, is able to actually understand that accountability and what is needed for healing. We just don't often ever give community a voice at the table. And often because the services are so individualistic, those people are so separated out and isolated in their healing journey that we almost create language where it feels like they can't invite anyone else in. And so then they're alone on that healing journey with maybe just you as a practitioner. And then you have to be their entire community, and that's not possible for you as an individual.
Yeah, so true. It's so important that we bring in the community as working in these spaces too, and working with our partners in these spaces and really bringing those local communities we have around us, all the different services. Like it's really so collaborative and so important to bring that in. I'm thinking about our listeners who often join on the couch and those with us today. We work alongside those priority populations like young people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, those with culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, and people who identify within the LGBTQIA plus communities. How do we create advocacy spaces that are truly inclusive when we're working with these populations?
Yeah. An incredibly important piece of work for every individual and organization and community space to do. And I think for those working in these spaces, this comes back for me about reflective practice. This is about attitudes and bias at a foundational level. I think sometimes we want to jump to policies, procedures, environment, flags on doors, acknowledgements on windows, which can all be really important signals and things that we need. But before we can go into any of those spaces, reflective work needs to be done about the attitudes and values and bias that you hold as an individual. This can be confronting work. And to be clear, everyone has bias. Everyone has internalized attitudes. You have all grown up in society in spaces that are predominantly sex negative, that are racist, that are misogynistic and homophobic and transphobic, because unfortunately, that's the society that we all kind of live in. And so needing to actually do some work to unpack those biases that we hold and attitudes. And that has to be done slowly and safely and critically. And knowing you have a bias does not make you a bad person. This is not about good and bad people. This is not judgment. It's just that you cannot accurately identify that bias if you haven't done that work in the moment when it comes out, And so I have bias, you will have bias, everyone will. But once you acknowledge it, you name it, you're able to see it really clearly, you will then see the impact it has on others. And that's really critical for inclusive spaces. You need to be able to see the way that your whole self and what you're bringing into the room creates safety or creates, something that is unsafe for someone. Because you come back to the idea, how are you opening the door and inviting in? And those are actually two separate things. You can open a door that doesn't necessarily invite people inside. Because I think sometimes people and a lot of practitioner spaces will open the door, but they don't do the inviting in piece. And then they go, I've done all this great work. Why is no one coming? And why is my space not inclusive? But I've signaled, I have a flag, I have a this, I've written something in a bio, blah, blah, blah. Don't not do those things. But that doesn't invite in. Inviting in can sometimes be you're actually reaching through the door, holding someone's hand and inviting them through the threshold. And that can only be done with some really transparent understanding of your bias and attitudes. And so you can signal safety because that tells people that you open the door. It doesn't prove it's safe to walk through it. That can only be proved through behavior and, consistently coming back. And it doesn't mean you're perfect. It doesn't mean you never make a mistake or an error or misspeak. It's about how you correct. It's about how you come back to safety and acknowledge any harm that you cause. Because sometimes we inevitably cause harm. Doesn't mean we're malicious or we have a malicious intent. The repair is how you prove inclusive, safe spaces.
I love that. I would love to just keep chatting for ages, but unfortunately we are coming to the end. So as we start to just wrap up today, I just want to leave some space for our listeners to engage with this conversation. And Lauren, if you would like to just share one or two key messages from our chat today to just kind of sum us up as we finish.
One or two, I can answer days. But I think, I think the last thing we just spoke of to me is critical if you're thinking about what do I do after this? If you're feeling like you have all this energy, I want to do all this stuff, but I don't know where to start. A great first start is reflective practice and thinking about bias and thinking about, even posing questions to yourself about, these ideas, like what are your attitudes around, teenage pregnancies? What are your attitudes around deficit lens language in some of these health spaces? Like, what are your values and bias? And just naming them. Don't judge them. Don't feel like you need to change or shift necessarily, but can we name them? Are we aware of them? I think it's critical. And then my kind of second piece, I'd say, kind of taking from today, is going, okay, where does community fit into your work? And just seeing where can community fit. And if there's if you go, I don't think there's any space or there's nothing that's been developed yet, there's your gap. Where does community come in? And what's your view of community? Is it like this big and like this little? What can community, and if you're working with an individual, what does community mean for them? Because if you're asking me to talk about my community, I'm sure that would sound very different than maybe someone else's idea of community.
Thanks for listening to On the Couch. We create this podcast because we are allies in actively challenging discrimination, microaggressions, and exclusionary behaviours.
We want to create spaces where people feel safe to share their thoughts, knowing that they will be heard and respected. Such an environment fosters collaboration, innovation, and contributes to a more inclusive society.
Follow us on your favourite podcast platform. That way you will receive every new episode when it's released. You can also help us grow the podcast by giving us a rating and leaving us a review.
Connect with us on Instagram and Facebook and share On the Couch with your friends, colleagues and family.
On the Couch is made by the team at Caddyshack Project. Until next time, peace, love and protection.